Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're just finishing up getting everybody seated, and I want you to go ahead and enjoy your lunch. But as I look at our schedule, we want to have time for our eminent keynote speaker and some question and answer with him, so I think we better get going, and we'll all get seated as quickly as we can. My name's George Lucas. I'm not that other guy. I happen to hold a chair here in ethics that's generously funded by the class of 1984, and my friends and colleagues, of whom there are very few left, I think, usually get tired of me having to explain that I'm not the other guy. But now I'm explaining that I'm not Ed Barrett. I used to hold the job that Ed now holds, or a job very similar, more or less similar, but in the performance of it, far less rather than more. In terms of what Ed has managed to pull together as a program for us over these next few days. He's done a remarkable job, and we're all in his debt. And I say this as I introduce our keynote speaker because Ed, who is always thoughtful, collaborative, and deferential, popped into my office a few weeks ago and said, "Do you think we could ask or invite Walzer?" And I looked at all of the people that would manage to get so far, David Roden and Jeff McMahon, and just it was this sort of star-studded cast of colleagues, and wondered, on the one hand, Professor Walzer can probably not refuse any invitation which is not submitted to him. On the other hand, he's probably one of those people who's even busier in retirement than he was when on active duty. So I don't want to set our sights too high, but go for it. So Ed went out, about 2 or 3 days later came back in and said, "We got Walzer." And we did our dance and our high fives and so forth. And then we found out what it was going to cost, both Ed and Professor Walzer, who was speaking in New York last night. He's teaching at New York University this year and speaking at a fundraiser for Dissent magazine. Had to give that talk and then hop the Amtrak milk run down to Washington, leaving New York at 9 o'clock. Got in at after 12 last evening. Ed picked him up at the BWI station, drove him to the hotel where he managed to get, I hope, a few hours sleep, and Ed crashed in the basement of my house downstairs, so he'd be ready to turn around 5 hours later and come in and run this. So that's the kind of work that goes in behind the scenes. And to both our eminent keynote speaker and our hardworking Director of Strategy and Research at the Stockdale Center, we're deeply grateful. You hardly need to introduce Professor Walzer to you, but let me just say a few things about him. He's published, as you know, more than 27, almost 30 books, and written more than 300 articles on a wide variety of topics in political theory and moral philosophy, ranging from political obligation, human rights and justice, to war, nationalism and ethnicity, radicalism, economic justice, and the welfare state. His articles and interviews frequently appear in the world's foremost newspapers and journals. Among his most renowned books, known to most of us here, are Obligations, Just and Unjust Wars, Arguing About War, Thinking Politically, Spheres of Justice, The Company of Critics, and On Toleration. Professor Walzer graduated summa cum laude from Brandeis University in 1956 with a BA in history. He studied at the University of Cambridge on a Fulbright fellowship and later completed doctoral work at Harvard, earning his PhD in government in 1961. He has served over the years on the faculty at both Princeton and Harvard and has been for more than 2 decades professor in the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he is now professor emeritus. He is co-editor of the journal I mentioned earlier, Dissent, a contributing editor for the New Republic, co-editor and contributor to several volumes in a series he helped inaugurate, a comprehensive, collaborative project focused on the history of Jewish political thought entitled The Jewish Political Tradition. Professor Walzer delivered the Stutt Lecture at the United States Naval Academy in November of 2002, commenting at that time on the prospects for the looming war in Iraq. It was entitled The Triumph of Just War Theory and the Dangers of Success. It's a privilege to welcome him once again to the shores of the Severn. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Michael Walzer.
Thank you, George. As you just heard, I've been in this business for a long time, and I still get very nervous when I am speaking to an audience like this one, which includes many people who know a lot more about war than I do. So this is an argument that I will make today with some humility. My subject is, I want to address the question, can the good guys win? And it's a question raised by protests from soldiers, our soldiers in Afghanistan, who say that the current rules of engagement make it more difficult to fight and more dangerous to fight and more difficult to win than it should be. And those are protests that we need to take very seriously. In some sense, the most important challenge to just war theory is this practical challenge, not philosophical, but a practical challenge. If we fight according to these principles, we can't win. We want to be the good guys, the just warriors, but if we fight justly, we will lose the war. Now, I suppose that this sort of thing has been said before. Certainly, winning armies violated the rules often enough, and they always claimed that the violations were militarily necessary. Today, however, breaking the rules is especially necessary, so it is said, for two reasons. First, the rising tide of human rights agitation and the new status and strength of international courts have made the rules far more stringent than they were in the old days. And second, the increasing importance of non-state actors, insurgent and terrorist organizations, has raised questions about how the burden of the rules is distributed. If the distribution is unfair, won't the burdened fighters be forced to break the rules and justified in doing so? In what is called asymmetric warfare between high-tech armies and low-tech insurgent forces, the insurgents argue that they are militarily weak, and so it is impossible for them to win unless they hide among their own civilians and launch terror attacks against the enemy's civilians. And their enemies claim that it isn't possible to respond effectively to those attacks without inflicting harm on the civilian population that exceeds what is permitted by the standards of jus in bello as they are commonly understood today. There isn't any way of going after the insurgents that does not produce excessive or disproportionate civilian casualties. So one side says that the rules penalize them for their weakness, so they have to break the rules. The other side says that their enemies are not only breaking the rules, but also exploiting them, and the only possible response is to break them again. Now, I'm going to engage these arguments, but there is another argument that comes ahead of it, which my own rules of engagement require me to take up first. What happens on the ground is radically affected by what happens in what we might think of as the moral political surround. There's an ongoing debate about what the rules are and how they are interpreted and applied in wartime. And it isn't only soldiers and insurgents who participate in the debate. All of us, citizens of a democratic state, we are also participants. And what we say and do counts significantly in determining how both sides fight. So let me begin with an outline of the moral rules, because the argument I want to make depends on that outline. If we understand the morality of war rightly, and if we persuade enough other people to understand it rightly, the claim that it isn't possible to win within the rules will fail. So this is a practical project in response to a practical challenge. I want to get things right. I also want to have some effect on the moral political surround. The crucial principle that underlies jus in bello is that civilians must be shielded from the violence of the battle. That means that they can't be directly targeted. Terrorism is ruled out from the beginning, which is what the terrorists complain about. It also means that injuries inflicted on civilians indirectly in the course of the fighting, what's called collateral damage, must be limited. the standard understanding of the limits is that the injury to civilians must not be disproportionate to the value of the military target. The point is to permit the attack so long as the target is really important and the risk to innocent people falls within a reasonable range. But important and reasonable are vague terms, and so proportionality turns out to be a highly elastic principle. It can be exploited in both directions to justify large-scale injury to civilians and to criticize any injury at all. And it offers little resistance to either of these uses. Consider an example from World War II. Here is a factory making tanks for the German war effort. Given the aiming devices available in 1943, an attack from the air will almost certainly kill some number, and possibly a very large number of civilians living in working-class neighborhoods around the factory. The factory hasn't been put in a working-class neighborhood for the sake of civilian cover. That's where they put factories before workers had automobiles. And given the importance of destroying the factory, the deaths of these neighbors will be considered, and were in fact considered, reasonable and therefore acceptable. Now, if that seems a relatively easy case, there are many more that are not quite like that, but are close enough or can be made to look close enough, and then again, the deaths will be considered acceptable. On the other hand, there are many military operations in asymmetric wars that don't have that kind of importance, though they may still be called militarily necessary, like seizing a terrorist cadre or hitting a rocket launching team. But suppose that the cadre is hiding in the middle of a village in Pakistan, and the rocket launching team is firing from the front of an apartment building in Gaza. In these cases, the operation is likely to produce civilian deaths, and these aren't so easy to defend. For many observers, they are not defensible at all. The tendency of lawyers and human rights advocates in recent years has been to focus on cases like these and to insist that any civilian deaths are disproportionate. But the war on terrorism consists in large part of small-scale engagements of just this kind. It seems to follow then that terrorism is immoral and fighting against the terrorists isn't morally possible. Now, the first of these propositions is incontestable, but that doesn't mean that the insurgents are prevented from winning by the rules of war. There are other strategies available to them, ranging from attacks on military targets and police forces, which are never literally impossible, to general strikes and massive civil disobedience. Indeed, in every insurgent organization that we know of, in all the organizations fighting for what's called national liberation, in all of these organizations, militants argued among themselves about what ought to be done, and many of them defended one or another of the alternative strategies. It wasn't obvious to these militants that there was nothing else to do but launch a terrorist campaign. So terrorism may not, in fact, be the only way to win. And once we consider what winning means, it may not be a way to win at all. In the Algerian War of the 1950s, that's an early example of asymmetry, the Algerian militants insisted in all their manifestos that they were fighting to create an independent and democratic state. But it is an old argument that terrorism will not lead to democracy. The band of terrorists is an elite group that preempts any popular mobilization and regularly produces authoritarian rule, first in the movement and then in the state. The Algerian case now provides strong empirical evidence for this argument. If winning means what the insurgents commonly say it means, then terrorism isn't the way to win. What about the second proposition, that fighting against terrorism isn't morally possible, that the number of civilian deaths will always be disproportionate? That is certainly contestable, though I don't think that the contest is at its center about proportionality. Years ago, when proportionality arguments usually went the other way and large numbers of civilian deaths were pronounced not disproportionate, I suggested that we should require positive efforts to avoid civilian deaths, whatever the results of our proportionality calculations. I argued for a revision of the classical doctrine of double effect, which held that civilian casualties were acceptable first if they were an unintended side effect of a legitimate military operation, and second if they passed the proportionality test. Since the second of these criteria didn't seem to me much of a test, we needed to strengthen the first. It wasn't enough not to intend civilian casualties. It was necessary to intend not to inflict such casualties. Two effects required two intentions. We should look for strategies and tactics designed, of course, to achieve their military objectives, but also designed to minimize death and injury to the civilian population. And those strategies and tactics might involve asking soldiers to take greater risks so as to reduce the risks they imposed on civilians. There are also negative responsibilities that come ahead of proportionality. States and armies and insurgent organizations must not deliberately put civilians in harm's way. They must not use civilians as shields in military operations, pushing them ahead of a scouting party, setting up a daycare center in a munitions factory, firing mortars or rockets from churches or schools, storing military supplies in apartment buildings. These are impermissible acts without regard to proportionality calculations. It isn't possible to argue that the number of children who might be killed if the munitions factory is bombed is not disproportionate to the value of deterring the attack. The children shouldn't be there. And it is the people who put them there, not the people who attack the factory, who are responsible for their deaths. It isn't clear to me, this is perhaps something we should talk about, how the children should figure in the proportionality calculations of the attacking force. Civilians being used by fighters are no longer disengaged from the business of war, even though they will still look innocent to us, and perhaps especially innocent. The calculations shift, though I don't know how far, in favor of the attackers who won't be responsible for the deaths they cause. Still, they might well look for a way of attacking when the children aren't there. The issue is much clearer with regard to civilians living around the factory who are always there. Now the attackers are responsible for the deaths they cause if they don't take care and if they don't take risks to minimize the collateral damage they know they will inflict. Now, that argument was meant for soldiers and insurgents alike. Its primary purpose in 1977 was to deal with the permissiveness of the old proportionality doctrine. But the current version of the doctrine permits hardly anything in the way of collateral damage. And if one combines a newly restrictive proportionality doctrine with a requirement of positive and perhaps risky efforts to protect civilians, and then with a negative responsibility not to endanger them, the resulting moral code, according to many soldiers and insurgents too, makes it impossible to fight successfully so long as one honors the code. And since the people who honor the code are presumably the good guys, there seems to be something wrong here. Now, some critics of just war theory argue that the wrongness has to do with the conventional claim that jus in bello is entirely independent of jus ad bellum, that fighters on both sides, whether their cause is just or unjust, have an equal right to fight and are equally bound to fight justly, that is, in accordance with the rules of engagement. But if the rules make it impossible for either side to win, these critics argue, then surely they must be relaxed for the side that ought to win. The ad bellum just warriors must be given some leeway with regard to in bello justice. John Rawls made an argument something like this in A Theory of Justice, his great book. He said, even in a just war, certain forms of violence are strictly inadmissible. And when a country's right to fight is questionable and uncertain, the constraints on the means it can use are all the more severe. Acts permissible in a war of legitimate self-defense, when those are necessary, may be flatly excluded in a more doubtful situation. Now, it's not a morally crazy argument. You can see where it is coming from. It's coming from men and women who are confident that they know which side ought to win. With regard to many actual conflicts, I share that confidence. I know which side ought to win. The problem is that it's very widely shared among people on both sides of pretty much every symmetrical and asymmetrical war. On both sides, the arguments are made with fierceness and conviction. We are fighting for national liberation. We are fighting in self-defense. We are fighting against terrorists. We are fighting for justice and peace. And so both sides are ready, equally ready, to claim the benefits of any relaxation of the rules. That's the old, and it still seems to me, unanswerable argument in favor of the conventional independence of in bello from ad bellum justice. There won't be any rules at all unless they apply in the same way to both sides. So if one side can't win following the rules, neither can the other side. But the rules are designed to make fighting and winning possible. They aren't pacifist rules. They are rules of war. They are rules for war. The design does, however, have a built-in limit. If the war can't be won according to the rules, then there is a probability, not a certainty, a probability that it shouldn't be won. The inability to fight justly is a sign that the war itself isn't just. In the 1960s and 70s, I made an argument of this sort against our war in Vietnam. I thought that war unjust from the beginning, but that was certainly not an obvious position. There were strong arguments in favor of the war. It was, after all, a war against communist tyranny. Its injustice was confirmed, I argued, when it became clear that we were not fighting only against the communists. We were helplessly at war with the rural society of Vietnam. The capacity of American soldiers to distinguish the insurgents from ordinary Vietnamese was steadily diminishing until pretty much every Vietnamese man, woman, and child looked like an enemy, looked plausibly like an enemy. The insurgents had won the hearts and minds battle, and whether or not the American war was initially unjust, it had become unjust. Now, that didn't justify Viet Cong violations of the rules of war. The rules applied to them exactly as they applied to the Americans. But the way we were forced to fight demonstrated pretty conclusively, I thought, that we should stop fighting. So the ad bellum, in bello distinction isn't absolute. Fighting a just war doesn't give you privileges vis-a-vis jus in bello. But fighting unjustly, being unable to fight justly, may in some cases deprivilege you vis-a-vis jus ad bellum. But how can this be a one-way argument, only from in bello to ad bellum? The hard question is whether the argument can ever go the other way. If we'd been fighting in self-defense in Vietnam, that is, against a real threat to the physical safety of American citizens, would our inability to fight justly have required us to stop fighting? Possibly not. I'll come back to that question. But America in Vietnam isn't a good case for addressing it, since our inability to fight justly was a function of fighting far from home in someone else's country on behalf of a very unpopular government for strategic reasons that had little to do with the physical security of American citizens. So let's consider the position of the Viet Cong, whose fighters were fighting in their own country. I said just now that they had no exemption from the rules of war. Suppose, however, that they couldn't win their fight, let's say for national liberation, without large-scale violations of the rules, without killing as many Vietnamese as the Americans were killing. Would we have to say then that the rules of war forbade their victory, made national liberation impossible? I think yes, we would have to say that, for their inability to fight justly would have been a sign that they had not won the hearts and minds battle. Now the old argument against terrorism would apply to them. They were an elite band of killers without popular support. I think we need a different and a harder case to test the good guys can't win argument. So let's turn to the Israeli war in Gaza in 2008, which is probably the sort of case many people have in mind, or Afghanistan is a similar case, when they challenge the current rules of war. Now, here's the case in simplified outline, without reference to Israel's occupation of Gaza in 1967 or its withdrawal in 2004, or the Hamas coup and the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Hamas militants had for some years fired rockets indiscriminately into Israel, hoping to kill large numbers of civilians, but with virtually no success. Since they fired at least some of the time from civilian cover, any Israeli response was bound to be problematic given the proportionality rule. Whether the attack was from the air or on the ground, it would kill many more civilians than the rockets were killing. And that would be called, and was in fact called, a disproportionate response. But what was being measured when this term was used? Disproportionate to what? Many people measured the deaths on one side against the deaths on the other, as if this was a family feud in Kentucky, and one family could kill two members of the second family, and so the second family got to kill two members of the first family, and then everybody went home. But this was obviously not a family feud. The number of Israeli deaths was very low, though there was always the possibility that one of the Hamas rockets would hit a school or a hospital. Do potential deaths count in proportionality calculations? Or should the deaths on the Palestinian side be measured, as in standard proportionality arguments, against the value of the military target? Let's say one of the rocket launching teams. But hitting a single team wouldn't have much value to balance against the civilian deaths the attack would probably produce. Should we consider the targets and the deaths cumulatively? What is the military value of hitting many teams, stopping most of the rockets, making sure that no school or hospital would be blown up? The single team measure justifies very little in the way of civilian casualties, and indeed makes it difficult or impossible to fight. The cumulative multiple team measure can easily be made to justify too much. During and after the Gaza war, most international commentators wrote as if potential deaths didn't count, and the single team measure was the right one. And so, in effect, they denied the Israelis any rightful response to the rockets. That can't be right. But the alternative proportionality argument also can't be right. It would have justified more casualties than the Israeli army actually inflicted in the 36 days of the war. Hence, the need to think about the responsibility doctrine that I sketched a moment ago. When Hamas fires rockets into Israel, hoping to kill civilians, they are responsible for any civilians they kill. And when they fire from civilian cover, they are imposing risks on their own civilians, and they are responsible for deaths caused by legitimate, that is, carefully aimed counterfire. At the same time, Israeli soldiers must take positive measures to minimize risks to civilians, and if they don't do that, they will rightly be criticized for the deaths they could have avoided. And this is true without regard to how the proportionality calculations turn out? What if Hamas rockets were killing large numbers of Israeli civilians? And the only way of stopping the killing, some analysts argued, was to respond in kind. If we assume that the anti-terrorists are the good guys here, which is my assumption, then we are finally at the core of the argument. The good guys can't win without acting like the bad guys. But I deny the premise of the question. There are other ways of stopping the rocket attacks. It is still possible to fight within the just war constraints so long as responsibility is rightly assigned and proportionality rightly balanced. But this answer will be taken as an evasion. The premises of what-if questions can't be denied. They have to be engaged. One way to engage these kinds of questions is to invoke the doctrine which was discussed this morning, the controversial doctrine of supreme emergency. If a country is fighting in self-defense and is faced with a looming danger of a catastrophic kind, massacre or radical subjugation, it can indeed violate the rules of war, and the only limit on the violation is necessity. This permission obviously extends only to the side that is fighting a just war. So here is the point where ad bellum justice overrides in bello justice. The distinction between the two collapses in a supreme emergency, and this argument applies not only to states but also to insurgents if they are fighting against an enemy engaged in mass murder or enslavement. I don't think there is any collapse short of that. The what-if question is persuasive only in an extreme form. But why should we draw such a hard line at such a far point? Why not adopt the sliding scale? The greater the danger the good guys face, the greater their entitlements in battle. This is the argument that I've already discussed, to which I responded in the same way as just war theorists and, I should add, international lawyers have been responding for a long time now. If a conviction of justice and a sense of danger are sufficient to allow violations of the rules of war, the rules will regularly be violated. But there is another response, a further response, which I think strengthens the argument against the sliding scale. And that is this: the scale has already slid, though not in a way that discriminates between the two sides. Jus in bello is already an adaptation of everyday morality to the necessities of combat. And absent extremity, no further adaptations are required. On this side of supreme emergency, it is morally obligatory to fight with constraint. And I haven't yet seen any plausible argument that this isn't possible when the constraints are rightly understood and the soldiers or the insurgents are genuinely committed to them. Their commitment is critically important. Soldiers have to be trained to fight justly, and their officers have to be taught the best ways of doing that. It is inexperience and incompetence, above all, that breeds brutality. Well-trained and well-disciplined armies are not brutal, and their officers and soldiers are less likely to think that brutality is necessary for victory. Their aim is to win, of course, and they take risks, first of all, for the sake of their military mission, and only after that, in order to minimize civilian deaths. And the second set of risks must not put the mission in jeopardy, else the first set would be pointless. We credit soldiers for their efforts to avoid civilian deaths, even when these efforts don't entirely succeed. What we must insist on is the effort, the morally necessary caretaking and risk-taking. Now, this position isn't an academic position, the product of professors far from the battlefield, designing ideal but unlikely battles. It's very close to the honor code of professional soldiers, though expressed in a different idiom, and it underpins the rules of engagement of some Western armies fighting in asymmetric wars like the NATO forces in Afghanistan. The rules promulgated by General McChrystal and then endorsed by General Petraeus require soldiers to take risks in order to minimize civilian deaths. It is true that these rules are not only morally but also strategically motivated. They are designed to win or to avoid losing the battle for hearts and minds. I've heard it said that this is the wrong battle. The better battle is for bodies, as it always has been. Only brutality will break the body, the back of asymmetric resistance. This is how colonial armies in the old days established their supremacy. But those were indeed the old days, before the age of popular mobilization and ideological warfare. I suspect that General McChrystal was right to think that morality and strategy fit more closely together in contemporary wars. In any case, it's clear that leading military figures believe that it's possible to win within the constraints of jus in bello, and even that it's not possible to win outside those constraints. But what does victory mean in these kinds of wars, and what victories are, so to speak, worth winning? If the old colonial wars required extreme brutality, we might well think, if we didn't already think, that these were unjust wars. They shouldn't be fought and they shouldn't be won. But let's assume that in contemporary asymmetric wars, the high-tech armies are sometimes fighting in a just cause. Winning won't be marked by a surrender ceremony and a victory parade. It will have less formal, less visible, more modest character. Its achievements will mostly be negative. The military political weakening of the insurgent forces, the radical reduction of terrorist attacks, and the creation of a not indecent government. The commitment to fight within the established legal and moral constraints is plausibly connected to these achievements, and wherever the hearts and minds battle is relevant, the connection is close. It may seem entirely irrelevant in cases like the Gaza war, where the Israelis were not fighting for Gazan hearts and minds. But in a democratic and ideological age, their ultimate victory or defeat depends in significant ways on hearts and minds elsewhere. Fighting with constraint can be, in multiple ways, political and moral, a good thing to do. But we have to insist that the constraints are rightly understood. As I argued at the beginning, the moral political surround makes a difference in what happens on the ground. And the surround has been more political than moral in recent years. The restrictive proportionality argument, which makes it so difficult to fight against insurgents and terrorists, is in part the work of people who are sympathetic to the insurgents and terrorists. One sees this most clearly in debates at the UN. And the argument that soldiers don't have to take any risks to minimize civilian deaths comes from people determined to defeat the insurgents at any cost. Of course, these political positions are also moral positions, and it makes sense that they will have an impact on arguments about responsibility and proportionality. And yet, I believe we should resist that impact. If we want to protect innocent lives in war, we have to work through the responsibility arguments, and we have to get the proportionality calculations right. And these arguments and calculations require us to bracket, not forever, but for a reflective moment, our political sympathies and antipathies, and to focus narrowly on what happens in the course of the asymmetric struggle. How should insurgents and soldiers aim their weapons? With what intentions? In what circumstances? With what degree of care? There are right answers to these questions, and the right answers won't deny victory to the men and women who adopt them as their military code. Thank you. So how are we going to... yes, Jeff.
I assume it's okay to start the question and answer session, correct? George, am I?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You distinguish two types of case in your talk. One is a case in which innocent civilians are deliberately placed next to a military target by the people who are perhaps themselves the target. The other case is one in which the innocent civilians just happen to be there. It's nobody's responsibility or fault that they're there. And you said in the first case, where the bad guys have placed the innocent civilians among themselves in this way, if the attackers then fire on the bad guys and kill the innocent civilians as well, the responsibility for the deaths of the innocents goes with the people who placed them there. In the second case, you said when the civilians just happen to be there, the responsibility for the deaths lies with the attackers. And the question that I want to ask is whether this location of responsibility for the deaths can affect the permissibility of the action of the attacker who's actually going to kill the civilians if he attacks. And here's a reason for thinking that it shouldn't. I'm assuming that you think that it does because you made a couple of references later in the talk to the importance of determining where responsibility lies, citing issues of responsibility. I want to suggest that there's a reason for thinking that questions about responsibility of this sort may not be determinative of the permissibility of action. And the test is really rather simple. You imagine one case where a certain number of innocent civilians have been seized and placed beside the bad guys. Another case in which a slightly lesser number of civilians just happen to be there. If you think responsibility affects permissibility, and let's say you have a choice of which of these two acts to take. We have two military targets. Each one will be equally valuable to us in achieving our just aim. If you think that the location of responsibility affects permissibility, then you should attack the target that's going to involve the greater number of civilian deaths, because in the example as I've set it up, the greater number of people have been placed there by the terrorists or whoever they are, and that diminishes their own responsibility for the deaths, making it more permissible to attack. Whereas I'm inclined to think that in these cases, this issue about responsibility shouldn't affect the permissibility of action, and what we should do is whichever act will result in our killing fewer innocent people.
I can't imagine any field officer ever being faced with a choice like that. It's a philosopher's example, Jeff, and I'm not sure I know how to answer it. I don't think of myself as a philosopher. All I want to say is that when civilians are deliberately used as cover, it has to affect the proportionality calculations in that case. I don't know how it compares to other cases. Imagine this is supposed to have happened in the Franco-Prussian War, according to the French, that civilian hostages were literally strapped to armored vehicles which rode into battle. And the French killed the hostages, fired at the armored vehicles and killed the hostages. Now, responsibility surely for those deaths doesn't lie with the French who did the killing. And I'm not sure how to, this I said in the talk, I wasn't sure how to calculate the proportionality issue. Here were 5 hostages strapped to a building, to a moving vehicle that was firing. Is destroying the vehicle proportionate or disproportionate to killing the 5? I don't know. But I think it's not the same proportionality argument as you would make with a group of civilians who weren't being used. Yes.
Yeah, so this is on the same set of issues, and I think this might help to resolve some of the issues that Jeff has with you. So you said that in cases where the insurgents have deliberately placed civilians in order to use them as shields or for whatever other reasons, that they should have responsibility for the deaths of those civilians. I think you're absolutely right to say that, but to say that is not necessarily to deny that the enemy who caused death of those civilians were not also, to some degree, responsible, right? So responsibility is not like a kind of loaf of bread that gets divided out so that one side has 40%, the other has 60%. It's possible that one side could be entirely responsible, but substantial responsibility could also lie for the attacking agents who act foreseeing but not intending the death of those civilians. So I just wonder if that would help with Jeff's case.
No, I think I said that. The responsibility shifts to the people using these people as cover, but that doesn't mean that the other side is without responsibility. They are still responsible for attacking carefully and perhaps taking risks to minimize civilian deaths. And they still have to make some kind of proportionality calculation. I'm just saying I'm not sure whether those civilians count in the same way in proportionality calculation. That's something I'm genuinely not sure about. Now, civilians are not just being used as human shields. When insurgents fight from civilian cover, they're not just trying to protect themselves. They are deliberately exposing the civilians. They want, because they believe that they will benefit from the deaths of those civilians, and they're probably right. So that's another reason for thinking that the attacking side has got to act with great care in those situations for strategic as well as moral reasons. Yes.
Michael, this asks you to think about the implications of your argument for support, let's say over the long run, for efforts in a situation where the good guys are engaged with those that need, for a variety of reasons, to be defeated. And so let me put it this way. The kind of argument you're calling for, which is that there are very good reasons why we train our soldiers the way they do and why we try to protect innocents in war and so forth, and that requires us to focus in certain kinds of ways and engage in certain activities that are likely, among other things, to prolong a war situation. That is, there's no quick sort of way you can get it over with by just killing a lot of people. And if you add to that the complaints that you articulate from soldiers that there's no good way they can win it, this, of course, will fuel public dissatisfaction with the way a war effort is going. And over time, the public will grow weary and say, let's just, we can't win it, so let's just end it. How do you think the argument could best be made in a context of political discussion and debate that there are very good reasons for why we should persist with these restrictions, knowing how frustrating they can be for the war fighters as well as for civilians? How do you think that most effectively can be put to those who are tired of the whole thing?
Yeah. Amitai Etzioni had a piece in the New Republic arguing against the McChrystal-Petraeus rules, saying we shouldn't get into wars like these, and it's precisely because of the kinds of moral dilemmas that they pose that we shouldn't. But if we do get into them, if we have good reason to get into them, then we should just fight fiercely and win. and damn morality. This is the war is hell argument, and it's best to get it over with as quickly as possible, and anything you do that gets it over with is well, it is, the claim is it is morally justified because fewer people will die with a quick, brutal ending than a long, drawn-out war. I have talked to some soldiers about this, both in this country, soldiers who've been in Afghanistan and soldiers in Israel who fought in Gaza, and they don't accept that. They say you can fight and win in accordance with these rules. And that's the argument that has, if you get the rules right, and if your soldiers are trained and disciplined, you can win in good time within these rules. And if you can't, it may be the case that you can't win anyway. So I think it's very important to fight the political moral battles out as well as the military battles in this case. Yeah, now behind you. Yeah.
Thank you. Really enjoyed your comments, Professor. Two issues with regard to constraints. You kind of talked about it a little bit. The first one is I did some work with regard to the torture issue about 5 years ago with some other officers. John McCain actually came up with the thought, at the end of the day, his argument was, it's not about them, it's about us, which is a utilitarian kind of argument for why you maintain the rules, the constraints, because you maintain the moral, not superiority, the high ground with regard to your own soldiers. That makes sense to me, like comments with regard to that. The second one seems to me, that you kind of brought this up as well, is the moral argument with regard to ending the war quickly. It's not just our guys who don't get killed quick, but you stop the violence on all sides. And the problem, the side piece of that is, I think there's a real question with regard to what does it mean to win a war. And that's you need to define that before you can have these other discussions. Otherwise, it gets to be a very long conversation about often nothing.
Right. It has become increasingly difficult to define victory, and I suggested some negative criteria, but it's radically unclear if you achieve those criteria, if you weaken the insurgent forces, and if you cut drastically the terrorist attacks, and if you create a not indecent government, can you then leave? It may be that even after you've done all those things, there's still a need for some military presence, or else it'll all go bad again. People criticize military engagement by saying you don't have an exit strategy. In fact, we don't know what an exit strategy would look like in these kinds of wars, and that's a subject for another conference. On the torture question, I think we need an absolute ban on torture, and we need to understand that in the local equivalent of a supreme emergency, we will do it. That's the ticking bomb case. I wrote about this a long time ago in an essay on dirty hands. I don't know of anyone who can actually look at the ticking bomb case. Now, it may not be it may never happen, but I'm told by people in military intelligence that it does happen. Here you have a source that has provided you with good information in the past, and who tells you that a bomb has been placed in an elementary school in this city. And you have captured somebody who you have good reason to think knows the location of the bomb. And you are the representative of the parents of the children in the school. That's who you are. You are a political figure whose first responsibility is to those people. So in that case, I think you break the rule. You don't change the rule, but you break it. Yes.
This may be a terminological question, but I want to wonder about the relationship between what you call your addition to the proportionality condition, which is that soldiers have to intend to minimize civilian casualties. So what many people discuss as a separate condition of necessity in the use of violence. So proportionality forbids an act if the harm it would cause to civilians is out of proportion to the importance of the objective. And the necessity is supposed to be a separate condition that says even if an act passes proportionality, it's forbidden if there's some other way of achieving the same objective that would be less harmful. Now that's a traditional condition. It's not formulated in terms of intention, but it seems to have very much the same result as what you propose as an addition to proportionality. So I've often wondered what you thought the relationship.
Well, the difference is that my argument raised the issue, and I've been wrestling with it and worrying about it and arguing with other people about it ever since, raised the issue of risk. What risks do we require our soldiers to take in intending? And the necessity question doesn't, at least immediately, raise that question, because on some military accounts, an alternative tactic which increases the risk to soldiers isn't part of it's out of the realm of the necessity argument. It just doesn't come up. And I want to say it has to come up, and I'm not, I don't know how to, I can't make any, I can't say the risk that soldiers have to take in this instance is 9, and over here it's 17, and over there it's 3. These are judgment calls, and they have to be made by field officers. And I've talked to quite a lot of field officers many of whom insist that they make those calculations, and they do ask their soldiers to take risks, that this is, and they also say, all of them, there are other units in Afghanistan or in the Israeli army that don't do this. And I think there is evidence that in Afghanistan and in Gaza, different army units fought not so much according to different rules, but according to different understandings of the rules, and that is a function of the officer, the lieutenant who is leading the unit.
Professor Walzer, as we did this morning with Professor Elstade, we wanted to present you also at the Stockdale Center with one of our oral conferences, not because we think either of you needed it, but to symbolize our gratitude to you both for helping us calibrate our.
Thank you very, very much.